I'll go ahead and unmute Dirty Dan. Dirty Dan, are you there? I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you in just a second to go ahead and ask your question. Okay, go ahead, Dirty Dan. You can talk.
Hey, Joel, I really appreciate the chance to be able to talk to you. I have
pleasure.
A question that kind of, it's a two-parter, but the first part is very short, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so under your Christian framework, do you accept the idea, the overarching narrative that God is all-powerful and omnipotent?
Yes, properly defined, yes.
Okay, so the question I had is, how do you reconcile the belief that, one, God is omnipotent, but also the paradox of omnipotency that comes with can God create a rock that's too heavy for God to lift?
Yeah, good question. I get asked that quite a lot, which you can imagine why. Because remember when I said yes, God's omnipotent but properly defined?
Yes.
Okay, so that proper definition has some parameters. So one of the things we believe as Christians is God is the standard by which we judge all truth. God is by definition true. And what is true must accord with the laws of logic, which incidentally, the laws of logic are also an expression of God's perfectly logical nature. So what that means is that because God is perfectly consistent within himself and totally non-contradictory, again, getting back to him being the basis of logic, God's attributes can't logically contradict one another. So God's omnipotence, we have to understand God's omnipotence in light of his truthfulness. So what that means is God's omnipotence must not be defined in a way that creates a contradiction. So, can God create a rock so big he can't lift? Seems to create a logical contradiction because God would be both omnipotent and non-omnipotent. That's just a problem not only for Christian theism, but it's a problem for logic in general. I mean, an atheist, anybody would have the same question. Just, can there be a concept of omnipotence in which it is also non-omnipotent? In other words, what we're really asking, break it down to its rudiments, is can A equal non-A in the same sense at the same time? And the answer to that is no, because logic is necessarily true. Logic must obtain necessarily. So, is God all-powerful? Yes. But God is also perfectly consistent within himself, within his own nature. So that omnipotence does not entail any kind of logical contradiction. It's like, can God lie? No. Well, does that mean God's not omnipotent? Well, no, because there's nothing in the concept of omnipotence as it actually obtains in God's nature that would require God, who is perfectly truthful, to be able to lie. That's not a limitation of God. That's a strength. It means God is perfectly consistent within himself. The benefit of that for us is that not only does it mean we can perfectly trust God, but we also can trust God not to violate his nature. So when God makes a promise, he is guaranteed to follow through on it. And as a Christian believer, I find great comfort in that because I look at, when I experience hardship in my life, and this is getting a little off track, but I think it's germane still to the question. I look at Romans 8:28 through 39, and I see the incredible promises about how God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And I say, well, I'm banking on that promise to be true. Can I really take that promise to the bank? Yes, because God is perfectly consistent. He cannot lie. He cannot and will not ever break his promises. And that does not negate his omnipotence, because omnipotence isn't just whatever we want to define it as. Omnipotence actually has its definition rooted in God, just like all of his attributes are. God is not adhering to some external standard of omnipotence. God's omnipotence adheres to the standard that is his own nature. So God is self-defining, and all of his attributes are defined as they obtain within his nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah. For me, it doesn't make sense on a logical level because you have to have the pre-assumed beliefs of the existence of God in the first place to be able to accept the logical terms of omnipotence being a thing that can't be self-contradictory, because omnipotence in itself creates the ability to have exceptions, or not. Well, in the concept of looking at God, if you say that something is omnipotent, then you have to be able to accept the logical contradiction that makes, because that would prove in omnipotence.
Well,
that makes sense. If
that's the case, if it's possible for God, who is a necessarily existent being, we're stepping into the Christian worldview here for the sake of argument. Okay, I'm not assuming you are a Christian, but again, you're asking a Christian, and you're looking for an inconsistency in the Christian worldview, the biblical worldview. So, if you're asking for there to be a logical contradiction within God, who is by definition the source of logic, then what you're saying is logic does not obtain. Logic is not real. Logic is actually false. Is that accurate? Would you agree with that?
Well, to not get too deep into the woods, I would say that logic is a man-made concept, and I think having a worldview that is self-referential when it comes to obtaining logic gets you in a very weird spot epistemologically. Like whenever it comes to obtaining truth or doing any of that, you kind of get roadblocked whenever you set up a worldview or ascribe to one, I would say, that is self-referential.
So do you believe, so in your worldview, logic is a human convention? Logic is conventional?
Well, what do you mean by conventional?
Logic is something that we invented. It's not something that's necessarily true about all possible worlds or the world in which we live?
Yeah, I would bite the bullet and say that it's a human-made concept that we either subscribe to or do not. Okay,
so in your view, then logic is not really a description of the way the world really is. It's just something that we've come up with, but the world itself is non-logical.
Well, logic is, for my worldview, is more of a tool to reach proper conclusions. And if you're coming from a set of presuppositions that say that this is true, and we're going to accept that this is true without the pre-thought of understanding that we can't make strong statements about the metaphysical, that really gets you into some deep water logically, or talking about any other philosophical concepts.
Okay, when you say proper conclusions, proper by what standard?
Like the one that creates the most positive utility, I would say.
Positive.
Well, I would.
Okay, so logic is a convention that we've come up with to reach certain ends?
Yeah, so it's a tool that we use for us to be able to reason out our beliefs in a way that creates a more consistent truth.
Oh, okay, so consistent truth. A truth as a concept itself requires logic for it to be a meaningful concept, because but you're so truth is not objective in your view then, any more than logic is, right?
I would say that truth is a concept that we all ascribe to in a certain way. There's better ways to do it than not, and that's what us arguing is.
But better by
because we have certain axiomatic beliefs that are, well, between the two of us, irreconcilable.
Yeah.
To the logical framework you're setting yourself up in, saying that truth is God and God is all powerful and omnipotent.
Well, yeah, you have to be careful. I mean, I'm not saying truth as an abstract is God and then personifying or anthropomorphizing the truth. I'm saying truth is what is perfectly in accordance with God's nature and what God knows to be true. But one thing we have to probably wrap this up soon, but one thing I would really encourage you to think about, I actually wrote an article on this on my website, thethink.institute. It's called 6 Reasons Why Logic is Not Just a Human Convention. And I have a podcast episode on this as well, which is linked there on the site. But in your view, a world where logic is merely a convention means that the world itself is not describable truthfully in terms of the laws of logic. In other words, that world is an incoherent world. It is actually a non-logical world. So what that means is all of our efforts to impose logic on our experience are actually literally exercises in falsehood, because the world in your conception is not actually logical. Logic is merely a man-made convention. Now, there's more problems with it as well, because if logic is merely a man-made convention, then there is no obligation for either you or I to adhere to the same laws of logic, which means you might express your view to me, and I might say I might interpret your view to mean the exact opposite of what you just said. And there is no obligation for me to think otherwise. I can literally negate your view because the law of non-contradiction is not something which actually obtains in the actual world, in reality. I can negate your view, and there's no obligation for me not to. And my negation of your view, literally me interpreting your view to mean the exact opposite of what you just said, is actually more in line with the way the universe actually works, because the universe, in your view, is non-logical. So me interpreting your position to mean the exact opposite of what you meant is actually more in accordance with reality than me trying to adhere to these man-made laws of logic, which actually fly in the face of the way reality actually is. So if this all sounds incoherent and crazy, it's because it is. It's because we don't actually live that way. We can't. We couldn't have any kind of discourse in that world. Furthermore, laws of logic that are merely conventional, something that we invent, they're not really laws at all. There's no teeth to them. So for you to object that I'm being illogical, or me to object that you're being illogical, is just us breathing sounds out into the air. They don't actually, our complaints would have no bearing on the way things actually are, no correspondence to the real world at all. And dare I say that by even positing a world in which logic is just a human convention, I think you're showing that you don't actually believe it's a convention, because you want me to understand you logically. You want me to understand that you mean what you mean, you don't mean what you don't mean, and that you, the law of excluded middle, that what you're saying is either true or false, not in between. So our human experience, it's impossible. Let me say this: logic is discovered, not invented. You didn't have to invent the laws of logic. Now, you might have learned about them, but Aristotle didn't invent the laws of logic. I did not invent the laws of logic. They're discovered as we reflect upon our language and the way that things are, and the way that things aren't. The laws of logic are unavoidable. They're necessarily true, because if they're not true, then they are true. You see what I'm saying? So, I'd encourage you to really rethink that.
No, for sure. I do have more to push back on, but I do want to give the spotlight to somebody else. I really appreciate you talking to me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate the question.
No problem.
Awesome. Thanks, Dirty Dan.